Okay, so quick thing before we get started. For Wednesday, we're going to be reading a couple of articles that I have posted on Georgia View. It's in the Week 5 folder. The Chumwesu, Morrison, and Gates articles. I actually haven't posted the Gates yet. That'll go up this afternoon. It took me a long time for the library to get the book to me, and I have to scan it. So that's for next time. We're going to be continuing talking about issues related to the canon and arguments over the status of the canon in classrooms in particular, right? Which is also kind of the main focus of what we're talking about today. So the primary subject of our analysis this afternoon is one William Shakespeare, regarded by many scholars and critics as the center of the canon of English literature. So let's start just by asking you guys what you think generally about Shakespeare. How much experience do you guys have with Shakespeare? How much Shakespeare have you read? Have you ever seen plays performed?
Well, in high school, I took British Lit, and he was like a constant stand-up we always read, and I got tired of it because we read it so much.
Okay.
And discussed why he was so important, or why people always talk about him so much.
Okay. What plays did you read in high school? Do you remember?
The main was like Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah. Because that's a great play to give to 14-year-olds, right?
Yeah. And we started that in 9th grade. We watched the movie.
Yeah, that was for us as well. When I was a student, we did Romeo and Juliet in 9th grade, and we did Hamlet in 10th grade, and we did Macbeth in 11th grade. And I think we did King Lear in 12th grade. There was like one a year, right? Is that how things went for most of you? Is that how your high school curriculums went? Was there like one Shakespeare play? You're shaking your head, Bethany, no? Did you have to read any Shakespeare in high school?
Just Romeo and Juliet in
Okay.
9th grade.
Just Romeo and Juliet in 9th grade, okay. And this is actually one of the things we were talking about last time, right? That, even within the same state, standards and texts kind of differ wildly from school district to school district, right? And even within the same school district, people who are on different tracks are going to take different classes, right? So not everybody is going to have the same level of exposure to Shakespeare, but you have had at least one Shakespeare play in high school, right? And have you taken any college courses that have done where you've done Shakespeare plays? Nope.
No, nothing I can recall.
Okay, what about the rest of you? What Shakespeare have you guys read or encountered?
Romeo and Juliet.
Just Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet? Okay, those are the big ones usually, right? Yeah. What about you, Sean?
Othello and Hamlet.
Othello and Hamlet. Okay. Key?
A lot, honestly. I took Shakespeare last semester.
Okay.
So that's all we did was.
Yes. Yeah, we are one of the universities that still has a Shakespeare requirement in the English department, right? Everybody has to take it. And that's one of the things actually that we kind of want to talk about today, right? Is why universities have these single author requirements, why in particular the Shakespeare requirement became a thing, and whether or not it's something that should still be a thing, right? That's one of the big debates that continues in higher level education, right, in English departments. Typically, more conservative traditionalist professors often want to keep the Shakespeare requirement. Professors who are a little bit more left politically and who are more liberal about the curriculum tend to want to either get rid of it or downplay it, right? So The reason why this is important is because this actually does have a direct effect on what you guys end up doing in the classroom in your progress towards degree, right? So why do you think we still study Shakespeare?
I know, like, on the chapter, they talk about, like, from other perspectives, they have the universal thing that, like, it can be applied to, like, life today as well as that thing.
Okay, yeah, so when we look at this from the traditionalist perspective, right, the arguments he gives, or that he puts in the mouths of the traditionalists, right, are first, that Shakespeare's plays are of unquestioned aesthetic value, right? Secondly, that they teach moral values. And third, that they have universal appeal. But what I'm asking here is actually not so much what the chapter says, but like I want you guys to think about this. Like, why do you think we still study Shakespeare? Why do you still have to take Shakespeare classes in high school and in college? Right, even when you take a class like Comp 2 or Brit Lit 1, right, you're going to have to read probably at least one Shakespeare play, right? Why do you think Shakespeare is all over the English higher ed curriculum? Give it a minute, think about it. See if you can come up with an answer.
I'm thinking maybe because like different, like subjects look at it from different perspectives. Like they focus on certain parts of it, what it is.
Okay, yeah, you can look at Shakespeare from a lot of different angles and get different things out of a Shakespeare play, right? In fact, we can just see like with the adaptations that come out every few years, right? You get some very traditionalist adaptations, right, where everybody is, wearing doublets and speaking Elizabethan language and waving rapiers around and things like that, right? And then others that they try to bring into a more contemporary idiom, right? Like, so for example, one of the movies that he mentioned that they mentioned in the chapter is 10 Things I Hate About You, which is a contemporary update of Shakespeare's comedy, The Taming of the Shrew, right? They have done, like I remember when I was in college, the Australian director Baz Luhrmann did Romeo and Juliet with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, who were the hot teen actors at the time, and it was set in like a kind of like Southern California rival gangs kind of context, right? So he didn't change the language of the play at all. They were still speaking early modern English. But the costumes and the props and the sets, right, everything reflected more contemporary aesthetic, right? So yeah, these plays are kind of endlessly adaptable, in part because they rarely specify scenes, right? You don't get much in the way of stage directions or set description. In fact, this is one of the reasons why characters will often launch into lengthy speeches in a Shakespeare play in which they describe where they are, because there wasn't very much on the stage with them. They didn't have a lot of set pieces on the stage with them to convey setting. So yeah, so they are really adaptable plays, right? Why else do you think might we still study Shakespeare? And if we think about these three traditionalist arguments, are any of these beyond question? Let's start with the aesthetic value question. How might we question the idea of Shakespeare's supreme aesthetic value? Are Shakespeare plays necessarily just better than other plays either of his time period or of time periods before or after?
I don't think you can say like definitely that it's better. It just depends on like the person reading it and what their interests are.
Yeah, I mean, that's the basic problem with questions of aesthetic value, is just as you're saying, right? They're subjective, right? They are very much dependent on the tastes and background of the person reading or viewing, right? So the primacy of Shakespeare in the curriculum suggests that he was highly valued by whoever was shaping the curriculum in its early days, right? Now, the other thing about aesthetic value, right? Shakespeare wrote, if you will pardon my language, an epic fuck ton of plays, right? He was extremely prolific. Some of those plays are real stinkers, right? Like for every Macbeth, there's a Titus Andronicus or a Pericles, right? So while Shakespeare's best plays are really good, there's a lot of poor to mediocre stuff in there as well, right? Yeah, some of his plays are a little sloppy. In fact, this is actually one of the arguments that French critics in the 18th and 19th centuries tended to make against Shakespeare. They argued that even his good plays were sloppy because they didn't obey the principle of the three classical unities drawn from Aristotle. Right? The French in the 18th and 19th centuries were very, very heavily into imitation of the Greeks and Romans. And so they believed that all plays had to follow the same principles that ancient Greek plays followed, right? So these were unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. So what this means is that a play should take place over a single 24-hour period, in a single setting, and there should be only one main plot with no deviations or subplots. And Shakespeare violates all of these rules, right? All over the place, like crazy. Macbeth, for example, takes place over a number of years in various locations across Scotland and England. Hamlet takes place within a period of months. And while most of the action takes place at the castle of Elsinore in Denmark, there are other locations as well, right? So the point being that, like at least according to this particular perspective, Shakespeare was sloppy. So depending on what perspective you look at him from, that aesthetic value is not unquestionable, right? What about the idea of teaching moral values? There are some Shakespeare plays where people get away with some pretty shitty behavior. I'm thinking in particular of The Merchant of Venice, which not only features an anti-Semitic caricature in the Jewish merchant Shylock, but also kind of makes it okay that the play's protagonists end up cheating Shylock out of what they owe him. Hamlet basically, sanctions revenge murder, right? So, whatever moral values are embedded in Shakespeare plays tend to be a little bit more complicated than our relatively simplistic notions of good and bad, right? And the notion of universal appeal. If Shakespeare's plays appeal to everyone equally at all times and in all places, should you need quite so many footnotes and marginal glosses and extra explanatory texts to get what the hell is going on? Yeah, a lot of the situations have universal appeal, right? But we still need a lot of help today to read a Shakespeare play, right? To understand what's going on. Now, to give you some sense of the complexity of all this, I just want to give you a quick visual example. So I have a Guardian article here from a couple of years ago, which features portraits that are purported to be of Shakespeare. At least two of them are known to be more or less genuine. And I just want you to look at the pictures. I'll scroll down through the pictures. Don't read the text. And you tell me which of the portraits you think are the ones that are most likely to be genuine. So this is the first one, the Cobb portrait. This is the Dorchester portrait. Those crazy roughs. This is the Droeshout portrait. The Chandos portrait, which is probably the most famous picture of Shakespeare, or the most famous picture that is purported to be of Shakespeare. Oh, today's mortgage rate. The Sanders portrait. The Hilliard. And finally, the so-called pork butcher. This is the bust that is on Shakespeare's tomb. So which of these two do you think are the most likely to be more or less reliably portraits of Shakespeare? And when you come to a decision, think about the criteria you use to choose. How many of these portraits look like they're of the same person? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I want to say about like 3 of them that kind of look extremely separate.
Yeah, there are some that look similar, that look like they could be the same guy, right? Some of them that look like they could be the same person at different ages. Let's go back through them quickly. So, pork butcher, Hilliard portrait. This one doesn't look like any of the others, right? The Sanders portrait. This one looks like it could be the same person as some of the others that are up a little further at a younger age, right? The Chandos portrait. The Droeshout portrait that appeared on the the first collected edition of the plays. The Dorchester Portrait. Look at that ruff. And the Cobb Portrait, which is one of those that has been most recently attested to perhaps be a portrait of Shakespeare. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I wanna say the Dorchester.
Yeah, what? Let's go to the Dorchester one. Yeah, why do you want to say the Dorchester one?
I guess it's more like I see a line and I kind of just have the English kind of stuff.
Okay, so the image looks familiar, right?
I'd say number 2.
What's that?
I'd say the first one or the Dorchester.
So you'd say these first two? These first two, yeah, do look like they could be the same guy, right? He's just got more hair in the first portrait, so he's probably a little younger, right? A little bit of male pattern baldness in the second picture. But yeah, I mean, like, both of these pictures, look like they are of a handsome, intelligent Elizabethan gentleman, right? The pictures that are most likely actually Shakespeare are the Droeshout and the Pork Butcher. The bald chubby guy.
Why is it called the portrait?
Well, because people who are critical of the sculpture think that it looks more like a local pork butcher than the greatest poet and playwright of his age, right? But why would that matter? What does that suggest about the way we want Shakespeare to look versus the way he probably did look? Right. This guy doesn't look like a famous poet, right? He's bald, he's dumpy. He doesn't look like, the man who commanded the Elizabethan stage, right? Whereas some of these others, the Cobb and Dorchester portraits, right? One of the most famous portraits is the Chandos, right? He looks, a little bit like a pirate, right? He's got the slightly open shirt and the gold earring, right? This is what people want a poet to look like. And the reality is that this may very well not be a picture of William Shakespeare, right? So what we need to do is consider how William Shakespeare became, all capital letters, Shakespeare, and what this has to do with the way he is currently received in English departments across the Anglophone world, right? So, what we're going to do today is an exercise in what scholars refer to as reception history. So can any of you infer from this name, reception history, what it is we're about to be doing? Exactly, yeah. We're going to be looking at a kind of timeline of how Shakespeare's work has been viewed in eras leading up to the present, right? And this is often a really valuable tool, right? Because it shows us that the way in which particular writers and texts are valued is not static, right? It's dynamic. It changes from era to era. For example, if you look at critics writing about Oscar Wilde in the early 20th century, in the wake of the sexual scandal that brought his career down. All they tend to focus on is what they see as the lack of moral value in his work, right? And kind of the decadence of his work. Whereas if you look at critics writing in the 1970s, by which time Wilde is more or less canonical figure, they are no longer concerned with the immorality or the moral dimension of his work, and are primarily concerned with how it fits into, like, say, canons of gay writing or canons of late Victorian writing, right? More generally. So Shakespeare, our pork butcher friend, starts out as just another early modern British playwright. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, yeah, he's a popular playwright. He's very successful. But he isn't necessarily more popular or more successful than most of his contemporaries are. In fact, he has other contemporaries who are arguably better beloved by the public. For example, his late contemporary Ben Jonson. Have any of you even heard of Ben Jonson? You've heard of Ben Jonson, okay. Have you read anything by Ben Jonson? Okay.
Just watched the movie.
Okay. And Jonson is still regarded as a canonical poet of considerable talent and importance. So if you take a Renaissance lit class, for example, you will run into Ben Jonson. He's still in the canon, he's still on the syllabus, but it's unlikely, except maybe in graduate school if you are a Renaissance specialist, that you will take a single author Ben Jonson course, right? It's probably not going to happen. Those are not offered. So what happens along the way here? Well, one of the things that ends up benefiting Shakespeare most is the temporary fall of the British monarchy in the mid-17th century. How many of you know who Oliver Cromwell was? Okay, Sean, you know who Oliver Cromwell was. Who was Oliver Cromwell?
He was a soldier in the army who basically defied Parliament in a way, tried to get Parliament to arrest the king from the country.
Yeah.
Executed him for such.
Yeah, he was himself a member of Parliament. But yeah, he had a close relationship with the army, yes, and was able to get a significant portion of the military to side with him rather than the king. And so yeah, he is the guy who's responsible for getting King Charles I beheaded, right? There's an old Monty Python song about Oliver Cromwell where they say that King Charles I was 5'7" tall at the start of his reign and 4'10" tall at the end of it. Less one head. But Cromwell was a Puritan, and so adhered to a very kind of strict evangelical Christianity that viewed most forms of celebration and performance as pagan in origin. So from 1649 till 1660, the theaters throughout England and English dominions were closed. So what this meant was that for this period of about a decade, there weren't any playwrights in England producing new material. So when the theaters reopened in 1660, they start looking back to stuff that was popular half a century before. So they revive Shakespeare. They revive Ben Jonson. They revive Christopher Marlowe. They revive these Renaissance playwrights who had been dead for a good bit before the Civil War happened, right? And they start putting on productions of their plays. Now, Shakespeare, being the most prolific of them, becomes the most popular in this period, right? Simply by virtue of having written more than anyone else. And by the 18th century, Jesus. Sorry about that, I forgot to silence my phone. By the 18th century, sorry, where was I? Before Mr. T started shouting at me. The 18th century, there are several new published editions of Shakespeare. And one of the things that happens to several of these editions is that, like, writers and editors in the 18th century find that Shakespeare doesn't quite accord with their idea of what a good play is supposed to look like. So they start rewriting the endings. In particular, a guy by the name of Nahum Tate rewrites a number of Shakespeare's tragedies to give them happy endings in order to make them better accord with 18th century literary and artistic values, right? Unhappy endings are messy according to neoclassical 18th century logic. You want things to end on a clean, positive note. So Tate rewrites Hamlet, rewrites Macbeth, rewrites King Lear, right? He rewrites them in ways that everybody gets to live. So we're seeing here that Shakespeare has often been adapted in new eras for different purposes, right? And that oftentimes the Shakespeare that is being celebrated is not what the actual William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon wrote. Now, in the 19th century, Shakespeare's primacy among British playwrights is by and large unchallenged. And these 18th century versions of the plays that change the endings, by and large fall by the wayside in favor of the original text, except in one interesting case. A clergyman by the name of Thomas Bowdler agrees that Shakespeare is the greatest of playwrights and that everyone ought to know and study his work, but he's uncomfortable with the amount of sex and violence in Shakespeare's plays. And, if you've read, Romeo and Juliet or Hamlet or Macbeth, they're pretty bawdy and they're pretty violent, right? So Bowdler comes out with an edition that he calls the Family Shakespeare, which presents Shakespeare's plays with all of the naughty bits edited out. Right, so it's a cleaned up, sanitized, censored version of Shakespeare's plays. If you've ever heard the word Bowdlerization to describe a version of a text or a movie or some other such thing where all of the dirty and violent parts have been written out or taken out. That's where that comes from. That's Thomas Bowdler's legacy, is that he has lent his name to a process by which people mangle literary texts. So good for you, Thomas Bowdler. Thanks for that. Now, the whole idea of Shakespeare's timelessness comes out of early 20th century new criticism, right? These guys keep popping back up, right? And the reason they keep popping back up is because, again, for so long in the US and in Britain, they were by and large the only game in town. So they were hugely influential. And what do we remember about the basic principle of new criticism? What is the only thing you need in order to understand a text, to produce a reading of a text? Just the text itself, right? You don't need any outside apparatus to explain it to you. You don't need to relate it to anything outside of itself. So, the new critics argue that we can understand Shakespeare on his own terms because what he is writing is universal. Never mind, again, that even by, say 1937, a good number of American students who would be reading Shakespeare would still need footnotes and a glossary to know what the hell was going on. Right? He uses a lot of idioms that are not in use anymore. He uses a lot of archaic words. A lot of his plays refer to political and religious situations in late 16th and early 17th century England that we might not be familiar with, right? So this idea of universality is, at least the way I see it, more or less wishful thinking on the part of the new critics. But by then he's firmly established as the center of the canon, right? And is not to be dislodged. So this is how a figure like Shakespeare, popular but not excessively so in his own day, becomes canonical, right? This is the kind of the process by which it happens. Later generations pick up his stuff, see something interesting in it, and it becomes something that's valued in particular by elite culture, right? Now, while Shakespeare is kind of pervasive in popular culture too, right? There is a lot of stuff in American and British pop culture, actually really more American pop culture than British. Shakespeare has actually always been more popular here than at home. Right, that doesn't necessarily mean that Shakespeare in the original is universally enjoyed or understood, right? The fact that you enjoy and appreciate Shakespeare is supposed to be one of those kind of markers of education and sophistication, right? So let's look at all this from another perspective, right? The biggest critics of the Shakespeare requirement in English departments are those who call ourselves cultural materialists. And yeah, I did mean to use the first person there. This is my own preferred mode of reading. So, have I used this term with you before? Have we talked about this at all? I can't recall if we did or not, because things being what they are, I can't remember what the hell I ate for breakfast today. So.
I just remember seeing on that Cromwell posted.
Okay, yeah, I think, yeah, I might have mentioned it on the PowerPoint when we were talking about how we can map M.H. Abrams categories onto different approaches, right? Okay, so essentially for a cultural materialist, what's most important in understanding a work is context. That the work is not shaped or created by the genius of an individual authorial mind, but that it's instead produced by a given set of cultural circumstances. So we look at things like politics of the period, religion in the period, economic trends in the period, and even some of the norms of authorship and distribution. In order to determine not just how a text comes into being and how it is most productively read, but also to understand how its audiences would have received it, right, in what sorts of forms, who was this intended for, what might they have thought of it, how does it relate to the important issues of the day, right? So we're primarily interested in relating a text to its specific context. And a part of that means understanding it in its original context. So we talked about Shakespeare as sort of popular playwright in Elizabethan and early Jacobean England. Does anybody know anything about the norms of play authorship in that period? How frequently did playwrights in that period work alone? So one of the facts that we have to contend with when dealing with Shakespeare as author is that for most of the plays he wrote, Shakespeare is probably not the sole author. So in Renaissance England, collaboration was the norm for playwrights. For example, we know that Thomas Middleton, another popular tragedian of the era, wrote the famous witches scene in Macbeth. The hubble, bubble, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, right? Yeah, Shakespeare didn't write that scene. Was almost certainly written by Thomas Middleton. There are other plays on which Shakespeare was known to have collaborated either with older, more experienced contemporaries when he was a young playwright, or with younger playwrights who were just coming up when he was old and close to retirement. There are also still Shakespeare plays sort of coming out of the woodwork, right? You know, the lost plays that we didn't have texts for, that scholars are still rediscovering, right? But one of the things we have to deal with, again, when we talk about Shakespeare, all caps with an exclamation point, is that this Shakespeare is a construct, right? It's not one guy. And even if he's not writing in collaboration with another author, he is working in conjunction with a set company, right? So all playwrights were members of acting companies. They didn't always act. Shakespeare was unusual in that he was an actor-writer. Right? So he took the stage as well as writing for it. Most of his contemporaries didn't, but they were still members of companies. And so they were writing parts for specific actors. In fact, we know who the actors in Shakespeare's company were at the time he was writing Hamlet. And so, scholars have done things like put together, a cast list of the original Hamlet based on what they knew particular actors' specialties were, right? So, the leading tragedian of the era, or the leading tragic actor of the era, was a guy by the name of Richard Burbage, who was a member of Shakespeare's company. And Burbage probably played the part of Hamlet. It's believed that Shakespeare himself played the part of the ghost of Hamlet's father. This also explains the relative lack of women's parts in Shakespeare plays, right? Where there are always substantially more parts for men. What do we know about women on the stage in Shakespeare's day? Were they permitted? So who played women's parts?
Guys.
Yeah, the parts were played by men, usually apprentice boys, right? So each company would have a couple of apprentices who were still learning the trade. And until their voices broke, they would play women's roles. So because any given company only had a couple of these apprentices at a time, there are usually only there's usually only a very small number of roles for women. We also have to consider, when we're talking about universality, we have to think about what politics were like, right? So we're dealing, with a period of feudal monarchy where you can't be too assertively critical of the government or the state, right? If you are too critical of the queen, for example, she might not have her guards come and clap you in irons, right? But your play still has to pass muster with a government censor first. And as long as the government censor finds that there is nothing seditious in it, right? There's no argument for rebellion here, right? There's nothing that's going to, get people in the stands agitated and throwing things at the queen and calling for her head. Then the play would be allowed to go on, right? But yeah, you had to deal with this with a board of censors who could choose, if they read the play and didn't like it, to ban it from the stage, right? So you're dealing with a much more authoritarian government when it comes to the arts. You're also dealing with concerns of audience. Right, you've got an audience that is paying for seats at different levels of admission, right? So you've got, on the one hand, in the cheap seats, which weren't seats at all, ordinary people. So they're not sitting, they're just clustered around the stage, which is a raised platform. And they pay a penny to get in, right? Then you have box seats up above for the prosperous middle class. And special seating for aristocrats. So this also affects the structure of the kind of play you're going to write. because you have to please audiences of different levels of sophistication and education, right? On the one hand, the people who are paying the most for their tickets are the most educated members of the audience, right? So they're going to expect perhaps something that touches on tradition. They're going to expect a certain level of poetry, right? But the people who are actually closest to the actors, physically, while the performance is going on, are the people who paid a penny and probably brought their own food, their own dinner with them, right? And if you don't please them, if they don't like the play, you are going to end up wearing their dinners. So this accounts for this lack of unity that French critics found so frustrating in English plays, right? Because you had to please these different groups of people. What was the other thing I wanted to say about this? And I think we're getting the point here, right? That we actually can learn a lot about why plays are structured the way they are, and how they're put together, how texts are put together, by thinking about these kinds of material concerns in the context of the era, right? What was that other thing that I wanted to say? You remember how I mentioned sets tended to be really sparse, and you often have these lengthy speeches in Shakespeare plays where the character spouts off, explaining where they're. It's like, we are in the forest of Arden now, or I am walking the battlements of Elsinore Castle, because you wouldn't see it otherwise, right? The reason for this is that it was hard to get set pieces on and off that raised platform stage. So it was easier to just write a passage in which the actors tell you where you are and let you imagine it, than to try to make elaborate set pieces, right? So, nowadays people go to the theater, they often expect a certain level of, special effects and set design, right? Like the helicopter landing in Miss Saigon and shit like that, right? But Shakespeare's audiences would not have expected that level of physical spectacle. So those are the kinds of things you focus on if you were a cultural materialist. And from this perspective, a lot of these questions that the traditionalists focus on don't really matter that much, right? I could get the same kind of information by comparing Shakespeare plays with plays by Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe, or Thomas Middleton or Thomas Kidd or any other sort of playwright of the era, right? In fact, I would probably want to look at plays by multiple writers to get a more complete picture of the era. So think of like the cultural materialist method as being almost a little bit more like archaeology, right? You're looking at a set of circumstances and you're trying to kind of like reconstruct a process from that. And so yeah, again, like from that perspective, things like aesthetics and moral values don't really matter quite as much, except in the context of the era, right? You want to think about how the text reflects the aesthetic values and the moral values of its period, but you don't necessarily care about whether or not it reflects contemporary values of those kinds. Does this make sense to everybody? Okay, so I want you to take 5 minutes, and I want you to just sort of think about arguments for and against having a Shakespeare requirement or any other kind of single author requirement, right? I want you to think about, like, and you don't have to agree with me on this, right? If you think that single author requirements are a good thing and that we should have them, then yeah, I want to hear what you have to say, and I will not, judge you because you don't agree with me, right? But I want you to try to muster the best arguments you can for either side, and see where you fall, right? So yeah, go ahead, take 5 minutes. Think, write, argue. Okay, just keep working quietly. I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, so where did we come down, guys? How many of you believe that there should be a Shakespeare requirement? Okay, that's 3. And you 2 believe there should not. Okay, those of you who believe there should be a Shakespeare requirement, what are your arguments in favor of it? Why do you think there should be? Don't all speak up at once.
What that I said was, it can teach like more, like kind of how you were saying, and then I also said that it can reveal similarities and differences between then and now.
I'm sorry, could you speak up a little bit, Kia? I couldn't hear that last part.
I said, another thing that I said was it can reveal similarities and differences between then and now.
Okay. So it can teach lessons about the past. Okay, what about the rest of you? What did you, Bethany and Sabrina, what did you guys think?
They're just classics.
Okay.
And also said that some people like material like that, like the language they speak and or not exactly the language they speak, but the way they speak.
Okay, so yeah, we could even argue that given the cultural importance that Shakespeare holds now, whatever the history of how he got there, right, that it's still important enough, it's still pervasive enough in culture, right, that it's worth requiring everybody to know it. Yeah, Sabrina, what were you going to say?
I have that everyone should have general knowledge of Shakespeare just because he's referenced so much.
Okay, so you can sort of file that under cultural importance, right? I mean, you know, even you know, as the textbook notes, like even a lot of the everyday phrases we use, right, originate in Shakespeare. So he did do a lot. He added quite a bit to the store of the English language in addition to English literature. Okay, what about those of you who are anti-Shakespeare requirement? Why?
I think that like kind of focusing on him so much, sometimes it might create like a bias towards like other poets or something like that time period.
Okay, so it creates less room in the curriculum for other writers. Is that a fair way of restating what you said? Okay, and what else? Anything else?
Basically, I just said the same thing in like different ways.
Okay.
So basically, that's what it is.
Okay, so your mind was running along a particular track.
Yeah.
All right, what about you, Sean?
Maybe subjective here, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Personally, I just find it a chore to read it.
Uh-huh.
Definitely. It's kind of like,
So we could say that, just to pause for a second, that the universal appeal thing doesn't work, right?
yeah.
Okay, keep going.
It's kind of like a perceived superiority over any other literature. Like you hear, Shakespeare and it's supposed to think of this. But
Uh-huh.
kind of going on what she said, kind of don't really know about anybody else. It's kind of Shakespeare was all it was, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, there were all of these other playwrights working in the same period who were just as popular. In fact, sometimes their plays are just as good. In fact, T.S. Eliot himself argued that Hamlet was simply an inferior copy of a slightly earlier play by Thomas Kyd called The Spanish Tragedy. It borrowed more or less the same plot, right? So yeah, so this does, it can create, I think, as you're saying here, and maybe this is also closer to what you meant, that it creates a false sense of what was happening in the period. So, yeah, I think by and large, most of the arguments against the Shakespeare requirement tend to rest on these kinds of historical principles, right? That, if what we value is looking at how things were then the Shakespeare requirement doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Or at least not solely requiring Shakespeare doesn't make a lot of sense. If what we are looking at is influence on the now, influence on the present, then the Shakespeare requirement does make a little bit more sense, right? So again, I guess it's a matter of the perspective you're looking at things from. We're not going to resolve this issue today here, obviously, of course, we're running out of time, but I did want to introduce you to this particular debate and some of the methods behind both sides of it. Because we're going to be sort of continuing this a little bit when we talk next time about writers of color who argue that the canon should be dismantled. All right, so that's all I have for you. Let's start cleaning up.